The coffee cup slipped from Magdalena Rawlins' fingers when the widowed father she just hired told her his full name. The ceramic shattered against the wooden floor of her kitchen, dark liquid spreading between the cracks like spilled blood. "You're one of them," she whispered. Asa Abraham Ellsworth stood frozen by her table, his weathered hand still holding the contract they'd both signed moments before. Outside, his 8-year-old daughter Molly laughed with the settlement children, her voice carrying through the mountain air like birdsong. The sound felt obscene now. "Ma'am," Abe's voice carried genuine confusion. "I don't understand." Maggie's breath came shallow. The name Ellsworth carved through her chest like winter wind through bare branches. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, needing something solid to hold her upright. "Get out." The words scraped her throat raw. "Mrs. Rawlins, if I've done something to offend, get out of my house. Get out of my settlement." Abe's face crumpled with bewilderment. This was the same woman who'd approached him at the Bitter Creek market that morning, her dark eyes bright with possibility. She'd watched him prepare cornbread and stew for the travelers, noting how his hands moved with practiced grace, how he spoke gently to Molly, how he nodded respectfully to every person regardless of their station. The job offer had felt like providence. Good wages, a cabin for him and Molly, a community where his daughter could thrive while he cooked for the settlement's communal kitchen. Winter was coming to the Rocky Mountains, and Sable Peak needed someone who understood how to stretch supplies, how to make humble ingredients sing. Maggie had seemed different from other employers. Her settlement buzzed with purpose. Former slaves worked alongside outcasts and dreamers, building something that defied the harsh realities of 1870s frontier life. She commanded respect without demanding subservience, her leadership earned through competence rather than birthright. Now she stared at him like he'd brought plague into her sanctuary. "Mama," Molly's voice drifted from the doorway. The child's face shifted from curiosity to concern as she read the tension crackling between the adults. Abe forced his voice steady. "Go pack our things, sweetheart, but we just unpacked." "I know." He knelt to her level, smoothing her dark hair. "Sometimes plans change." Molly's lower lip trembled. Since her mother's death 8 months ago, every goodbye felt permanent. Every departure carried the weight of loss too heavy for small shoulders. Maggie watched this tender exchange and felt her resolve waver. Then the name echoed in her mind again. Ellsworth, the family that had owned her grandmother, her mother, herself. The name carved into the whipping post behind the big house in Charleston. The name her brother had whispered with his dying breath as they fled through South Carolina swampland. "1 hour," she said. "I want you gone in 1 hour." The settlement's afternoon rhythm stuttered as word spread. Josephine Baptiste, Maggie's closest friend and the settlement's unofficial second-in-command, found Maggie sitting on her cabin steps, staring at the distant peaks. "You want to explain what just happened?" Joe's mixed heritage had taught her to read the subtle signs of racial trauma. Something had triggered Maggie's deepest wounds. "He's an Ellsworth." Joe's expression shifted. She knew the stories. Every freed slave carried stories that could break a person if held too tightly. That doesn't make him his ancestors. It makes him dangerous. To who? That man just spent an hour making soup for Mrs. Henderson's sick boy, for free. Maggie's hands clenched in her lap. The logical part of her mind recognized Joe's point. Abe had shown nothing but kindness since arriving in Bitter Creek 3 days ago. He'd helped elderly Mr. Cooper repair his wagon wheel. He'd shared his remaining flour with a family whose supplies had spoiled. He'd treated every person with the same quiet dignity. But logic couldn't silence the screaming in her chest every time she heard his name. Through her cabin window, she watched Abe efficiently pack their meager belongings. No anger colored his movements, only resignation. He'd clearly faced unexplained rejection before. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it twisted something uncomfortable in her stomach. Molly sat on their cabin steps, shoulders shaking with silent tears. The other children gathered around her, offering small comforts. They'd welcomed her so quickly, these little ones who understood what it meant to start over. "He's leaving because of his name," Joe said quietly, "not because of anything he's done. Sometimes that's enough. For surviving, maybe. But you built Sable Peak to be more than survival." The words hit their mark. Maggie had indeed built something more than mere survival. Her settlement thrived because it judged people by their actions rather than their bloodlines. Former slaves worked beside former Confederate deserters. Children of mixed heritage played with children of every shade. She'd created what she'd dreamed of during those long nights fleeing north, a place where a person's worth wasn't determined by their past. Now she was betraying that vision because of a name. Abe emerged from the cabin carrying two worn satchels. Molly followed, clutching a rag doll that had seen better days. They walked toward the settlement's edge, where their horse waited patiently. Other residents had gathered to watch. Some looked confused. Others whispered among themselves, trying to understand why their steady, practical leader had suddenly turned volatile. The questions in their eyes felt like accusations. "This will follow you," Joe said. "Whatever happened in that kitchen, it'll eat at you until you make it right." Maggie knew Joe was right, but making it right would require facing the things she'd spent 20 years burying. It would mean looking past the name that had haunted her dreams and seeing the man who carried it. The sun dipped behind the western peaks as Abe lifted Molly onto their horse. The child looked back at Sable Peak with the particular sadness of someone who'd glimpsed belonging only to have it snatched away. Maggie rose from her steps. Her legs felt unsteady, but she walked toward them anyway. The entire settlement seemed to hold its breath. "Wait!" Abe turned at Maggie's voice, his hand still steadying Molly on the horse. The word hung in the mountain air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Maggie's throat worked against itself. The settlement watched, waiting for words that wouldn't come. She'd built her life on decisive action, but now she stood paralyzed between her past and the man who carried its weight in his name. "Tomorrow," she finally managed. "We'll talk tomorrow." The promise felt like swallowing broken glass. Abe studied her face, searching for some hint of what had shifted. He found only exhaustion carved deep as canyon walls. "The cabin, keep it tonight." She turned away before he could respond, her boots grinding against the dust with each step back to her own door. The settlement dispersed slowly, conversations crackling like distant thunder. Questions without answers always bred the most dangerous kind of talk. That night, Maggie barricaded herself inside her cabin. The walls felt too thin, the silence too heavy. Memories pressed against her skull like flood water against a failing dam. The Ellsworth plantation house rising white and terrible against Charleston's humid sky. The sound of her mother's voice, thin with fear, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Her brother Samuel's hand in hers as they ran through the swamp, his blood warm and sticky against her palm where the overseer's whip had caught him across the wrist. The name carved into the whipping post, Ellsworth, carved into her memory deeper than any blade could reach. Samuel had died 3 days into their escape, fever taking what the plantation's cruelty had already broken. She'd buried him in Georgia clay and promised his grave she'd never let that name touch her again. Now it lived in her settlement. It had unpacked its belongings and made her an accomplice in her own haunting. Joe knocked twice before entering without invitation, the privilege of 20 years' friendship. Eating would be a good start. Maggie hadn't touched the cornbread Joe had left that afternoon. It sat hard and cold on her table, another small failure in a day full of them. "Tell me about him," Joe said, settling into the chair across from her. "The man, not the name. You tell me. You've been watching him since he arrived." Joe's mouth curved slightly. Trust Maggie to notice her surveillance. Nothing happened in Sable Peak without Maggie's awareness, even when grief clouded her judgment. Clean, polite, skilled with his hands and gentle with his daughter, pays his debts, helped Mrs. Chen with her roof repair yesterday without being asked. And he carries sorrow deeper than that child deserves to inherit. Through her window, Maggie could see warm light glowing from the cabin where Abe and Molly had settled for one more night. Shadows moved against the curtains. A father helping his daughter prepare for bed, probably wondering how many more towns they'd flee before finding peace. I did some asking around, Joe continued. Interesting thing about Mr. Ellsworth. Maggie's spine stiffened. He's been funding schools, colored schools from here to Mississippi, uses what's left of family money to pay teachers, buy books, quiet about it, doesn't want recognition. The words landed heavier than stones. Maggie absorbed them slowly, turning each piece over in her mind. That's supposed to matter. Makes him different from his blood, doesn't it? Different how? He throws money at guilt, and that erases generations of suffering. Different because he's trying. The distinction felt important, though Maggie couldn't name why. She'd known plenty of white folks who talked a good game about justice while keeping their hands clean and their consciences comfortable. But funding schools took real sacrifice. It meant choosing former slaves' children over his own family's approval. It meant making enemies of his own kind. Why'd he leave Charleston? That's his story to tell. Joe's deflection carried its own weight. Whatever had driven Abe west, it hadn't been simple wanderlust. Men didn't abandon comfortable lives to cook in frontier settlements unless staying put meant something worse than starting over. The next morning brought Dutch Morrison. Maggie was splitting kindling behind her cabin when she heard his horse. The man rode like he owned everything his shadow touched, which in Bitter Creek's case wasn't far from true. He'd been circling the smaller settlements for months, making offers that sounded generous until you read the fine print. Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Morrison dismounted with practiced ease, his coat too clean for honest frontier living. Troubles with your hired help. My business is my own. Course it is, just neighborly concern. His smile carried the warmth of January wind. Folk are wondering about your judgment lately. Hiring and firing the same man inside an hour makes a settlement look unstable. Maggie's axe bit deeper into the wood. Morrison's words held truth she couldn't deny. Leadership meant consistency, reliability. Yesterday's scene had shown her community a leader ruled by forces they didn't understand. Instability's bad for everyone, Morrison continued. Scares off investment, makes neighbors nervous about their own security. That a threat? That's business sense talking. Smart woman like you understands how reputation affects prosperity. He remounted smoothly, settling into his saddle with the confidence of a man who'd planted seeds he expected to flourish. Offer still stands, Mrs. Rawlins. Fair price for good land, enough to start fresh somewhere more suitable. His horse kicked up dust as he rode toward Bitter Creek proper. Maggie watched until he disappeared around the bend, her hands tight on the axe handle. Morrison's timing felt too convenient. Men like him fed on other people's weaknesses, turning private struggles into public doubt. She found Abe behind his cabin, teaching Molly to identify edible mountain plants. The child crouched beside him, her face serious with concentration as he pointed out the subtle differences between useful herbs and dangerous mimics. Lamb's quarters, he said, brushing dirt from green leaves. Safe to eat raw or cooked, but not this one. He indicated a similar plant growing nearby. This'll make you sick. How do you tell? Patience, looking close. Understanding that things aren't always what they seem. His eyes found Maggie's over his daughter's head. The words carried weight beyond their botanical lesson. We need to talk, Maggie said. Molly glanced between the adults, her small hands still clutching the edible greens. She'd learned to read tension the way other children read picture books. Too much practice for someone so young. Go wash those for lunch, Abe told her gently. I'll be along. The child obeyed reluctantly, casting worried looks over her shoulder. Abandonment had taught her that adult conversations usually meant another ending. Morrison was here this morning, Maggie said once Molly was safely inside. The land buyer. You know him. Know his type. Men who profit from other people's troubles. Abe's assessment carried the weariness of personal experience. Another piece of the puzzle that was his past, another question Maggie didn't have the right to ask. Your name's bringing attention I don't need. Then we'll go. The answer came too quickly, too final. This was a man accustomed to running, to carrying whatever burden his bloodline represented from town to town until someone recognized the weight of it. "That what you want?" Abe looked toward his cabin, where Molly's silhouette moved against the window. His daughter deserved better than permanent exile for crimes she'd never committed, carrying shame she'd never earned. "What I want doesn't change what I am." "What are you?" The question hung between them, sharp as winter air. Abe studied Maggie's face, searching for condemnation he'd learned to expect. He found only exhaustion that matched his own. The son of people who owned human beings. The grandson of men who got rich selling children away from their mothers. His voice carried no self-pity, only the flat certainty of someone who'd made peace with ugly truths. "And now I'm a widower with a daughter who deserves better than paying for her great-grandfather's sins." The words settled between them like dust after a storm, not absolution but acknowledgement. The first honest exchange they'd managed since his name had shattered her kitchen peace. "Tell me about the schools," Maggie said. Surprise flickered across Abe's features. "Joe's been investigating." "Smart woman. Doesn't trust easily." "Neither do I. Then why ask?" Because sleeping had become impossible. Because Morrison's visit felt like a warning shot. Because her settlement deserved a leader who made decisions based on what was right rather than what was scared. Because maybe what you want does matter after all. The agreement they reached felt fragile as first ice on a mountain pond. Abe could stay, but only as hired help. No friendship. No trust beyond what his cooking skills could earn. Maggie laid out the terms with military precision. He'd prepare meals for the settlement's communal kitchen. Keep to himself otherwise. Any trouble, any whisper of his past causing problems, and he'd be gone before sunset. Abe accepted every condition without argument. He'd learned that gratitude meant swallowing pride, that second chances came with chains attached. The settlement watched this uneasy peace with careful eyes. Some residents nodded approval at Maggie's practical decision. Others whispered about leaders who changed direction with the wind. Questions lingered in every shared glance, every half-finished conversation. Trust, once cracked, took time to heal properly. Abe threw himself into work with the intensity of a man trying to prove his worth through sweat and flour. He rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent afternoons preserving vegetables for winter storage, passed evenings planning meals that would stretch their supplies through the harsh months ahead. His hands moved with practiced certainty, turning humble ingredients into something approaching comfort. Dried beans became hearty stews. Preserved meat found new life in savory pies. Root vegetables transformed under his knife into dishes that reminded people of better times. The settlement's children gathered outside the kitchen during preparation hours, drawn by aromas that spoke of security and care. Molly joined them hesitantly, still uncertain whether this place would become home or just another temporary stop. Maggie found herself watching these small gatherings from her cabin window. The children's laughter carved something loose in her chest, a warmth she'd forgotten she could feel. When had she last heard such uncomplicated joy from her people? Winter's first serious threat arrived during the third week of October. Snow fell thick and early, blanketing the settlement in silence that felt more ominous than peaceful. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, catching everyone unprepared for nature's sudden violence. Mrs. Henderson's grandson developed a fever that wouldn't break. Her usual remedies failed against whatever sickness had taken hold of the boy's small body. Panic crept through the settlement as other children began showing similar symptoms. Abe appeared at Maggie's door that evening carrying a steaming pot and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "Willow bark tea," he said. "My late wife's recipe. Good for bringing down fevers." Maggie studied his face, searching for ulterior motives behind the offer. She found only concern carved deep as winter shadows. Why help? Because sick children don't care about their caregiver's bloodline. The medicine worked. By morning, the Henderson boys' fever had broken. Other affected children showed improvement throughout the day. Parents who'd watched their babies suffer through the night looked at Abe with something approaching gratitude. Word spread quickly through the settlement. The Ellsworth man knew healing as well as cooking. His knowledge came from love rather than duty, passed down by a wife whose memory he carried in every careful preparation. Maggie felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully constructed boundaries. She'd hired Abe for his practical skills, not his humanity. But humanity had a way of asserting itself despite her best efforts to ignore it. Dutch Morrison returned during the fever crisis, his timing sharp as a blade finding its mark. He rode through the settlement with exaggerated concern, noting the sick children, the early snow, the general air of struggling against forces beyond their control. "Heard you've got troubles," he told Maggie. "Sickness, winter coming hard, makes a man think about security." His eyes lingered on Abe, who was distributing soup to families caring for recovering children. Morrison's smile held the satisfied gleam of a hunter who'd found fresh tracks. "Your neighbors are getting nervous," Morrison continued. "Settlement that can't protect its children makes everyone question their own safety. We're managing fine. Course you are. Strong woman like you always manages. Question is whether managing's enough anymore." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket, the motion smooth as a card sharp revealing his winning hand. "Updated offer. More generous than before. Enough to relocate somewhere warmer, more suitable for raising families." Maggie didn't touch the paper. Morrison's generosity always came with invisible strings attached, obligations that revealed themselves only after signatures dried on contracts. "Not interested. Think about it. Winter's barely started and you're already fighting sickness. What happens when the real storms hit? When supplies run low and people start wondering if their leader's judgment can be trusted?" His words carried the weight of recent memory. Everyone knew about her breakdown over Abe's name, her moment of apparent instability. Morrison was simply reminding her that weakness, once exposed, became permanent ammunition in other people's hands. "Folk are already talking," he pressed, "wondering why you keep that Ellsworth fellow around after your initial reaction. Makes them question what else you might be hiding." The threat wrapped itself in concern, but its edges showed sharp and clear. Morrison wasn't just buying land anymore. He was buying doubt, fear, the corrosive uncertainty that could destroy communities from within. "My business stays my business. For now. But winter has a way of making everyone's business public. Hard to keep secrets when survival depends on trust." After Morrison left, Maggie found herself standing outside the communal kitchen. Through the window, she watched Abe teaching Molly to knead bread dough. His hands covered hers, guiding her small fingers through motions older than memory. The child laughed at something her father whispered, the sound bright against winter's gathering darkness. Other children pressed against the glass, watching the lesson with hungry eyes. Not hunger for bread, but for the patient attention of an adult who had time for their questions. When had anyone in Sable Peak last received such focused care? Joe appeared beside her, following her gaze toward the kitchen's warm light. "Good with children. It's his job. Teaching bread making to a room full of kids isn't his job. That's something else entirely." Maggie couldn't argue the point. Abe had quietly expanded his role beyond their agreement, becoming teacher-healer, the steady presence children sought when their own parents were too tired or worried to provide comfort. "Morrison's pushing harder," Maggie said. "Expected that. Men like him smell weakness from 3 counties away." "You think I'm weak?" Joe considered the question with characteristic honesty. Their friendship had survived 20 years because neither woman wasted time on comfortable lies. "Think you're scared. Different thing entirely." "Scared of what?" "Scared that helping him might mean betraying your brother's memory. Scared that trusting him makes you responsible if he fails. Scared that maybe, just maybe, there's room in this world for redemption after all." The words hung between them, sharp as winter air. Joe had always possessed the uncomfortable gift of naming truths others preferred to avoid. "Samuel died hating that name. Samuel died protecting you. Different motivation entirely." Through the kitchen window, Abe lifted Molly so she could reach the high shelf where flour was stored. The child's face glowed with the particular joy of feeling useful, of contributing something valuable to the adult world. "He's not going anywhere," Joe observed. "Not until someone forces him out." Maggie understood the implication. Morrison would keep pushing, keep finding new pressure points until something gave way. The settlement couldn't afford prolonged uncertainty, couldn't survive a winter of internal doubt and external threats. She had to choose. Trust the man whose name carried generations of pain, or surrender to the forces that had shaped her entire life around fear. The decision felt heavier than mountains, more dangerous than any winter storm. But watching Abe's gentle patience with children who weren't his own, seeing the hope growing in Molly's eyes as she finally found adults who stayed instead of leaving, Maggie realized she'd already begun choosing. The question was whether she had courage enough to see that choice through to its conclusion. The first genuine smile passed between Maggie and Abe on a November morning when Molly presented them both with a carefully shaped biscuit she'd made herself. The child stood between the two adults, her flour-dusted face bright with pride, waiting for approval from the people who'd become her anchors. Maggie bit into the biscuit, chewed thoughtfully, then nodded with solemn appreciation. "Perfect." Abe's eyes met hers over his daughter's head. For one unguarded moment, they weren't the descendant of slaves and the descendant of slave owners. They were simply two adults sharing wonder at a child's accomplishment. The moment passed quickly, but something had shifted. The ice between them began its slow thaw. Their conversations grew longer, less careful. Abe shared stories of his late wife's herb garden, how she'd taught him to read sickness in the color of leaves, healing in the scent of properly dried roots. Maggie found herself describing the community garden she'd planned for spring, the way she envisioned rows of vegetables feeding not just bodies but hope. The settlement noticed these small changes. Residents stopped watching their interactions with the hungry attention of people waiting for disaster. Children began approaching Abe without fear, drawn by his patient answers to endless questions about cooking, plants, the world beyond the mountains. Molly bloomed under this acceptance. Her laughter came easier, her sleep sounder. She began calling Maggie Miss Maggie with genuine affection, the title carrying weight neither woman had expected. But the growing peace couldn't hold back the truth pressing against Sable Peak's borders. Joe found Maggie splitting kindling behind her cabin on a gray December morning, her movements sharp with suppressed energy. "Morrison's been busy," Joe said without preamble. Maggie's axe paused mid-swing. "How busy?" "Bought out the Hendricks place yesterday. The Morrison spread now runs right up to our eastern border." The implications settled heavy as winter snow. Morrison had been circling them for months, acquiring adjacent properties with the patience of a hunter positioning for the perfect shot. Now he controlled nearly everything surrounding Sable Peak. What's he want with so much land? Same thing he's always wanted, everything. Joe pulled a letter from her coat pocket, the paper crisp with official importance. This came through the territorial office. Unofficial word from someone who owes me favors. Maggie read quickly, her expression darkening with each line. Morrison wasn't working alone. His backing came from investors in Charleston, old money with familiar names attached to familiar interests. The Ellsworth family name appeared twice in the correspondence. "They know he's here," Maggie said. "Been tracking him since he left South Carolina. Morrison's just the local face on their operation." The conspiracy made terrible sense. Abe's relatives hadn't simply disowned him for his beliefs. They'd marked him for systematic destruction, determined to erase every trace of his betrayal from the world. They want the land. They want him broken. The land's just how they plan to do it. Maggie folded the letter carefully, her mind already calculating angles and options. She'd built Sable Peak to be more than just another settlement. It represented proof that former slaves could create something lasting, something worthy. Letting Morrison destroy it would validate every ugly assumption about her people's capabilities. How long do we have? Not long. Morrison's been making generous offers to our neighbors. Few more sales and we'll be completely surrounded. Through her cabin window, Maggie could see Abe teaching a group of children to preserve vegetables for winter storage. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his attention focused entirely on their eager faces. He'd found purpose here, peace for himself and his daughter. The Ellsworth family intended to take that peace and grind it under their expensive boots. That evening, Maggie knocked on Abe's cabin door. He answered with flour on his hands and concern in his eyes, immediately sensing the weight she carried. "We need to talk." Molly looked up from her drawing, her small face already tightening with the anxiety of a child who'd learned that serious adult conversations usually meant upheaval. "Go visit the Chen children," Abe told her gently. "I'll collect you later." The child gathered her papers reluctantly, casting worried glances between the adults. Abe knelt to her level, smoothing her dark hair with floury fingers. "Just talking, sweetheart. No packing tonight." Molly nodded but didn't look convinced. Too many promises had been broken in her short life. After she left, Maggie showed Abe the letter. He read it twice, his expression growing more haggard with each pass through the damning words. "My uncle's work," he said finally. "He never forgave me for walking away from the family business. What did you take when you left?" "Nothing that belonged to me. Everything that did." The distinction mattered. Abe had inherited wealth built on human suffering, then given it away to the children of the people his family had enslaved. His relatives saw this as theft rather than justice. "They'll keep coming, until they get what they want." "Which is?" Abe looked toward the door where his daughter had disappeared, then back at Maggie's determined face. "Me destroyed. You along with me if that's what it takes." The honesty cut clean as a sharp blade. No false comfort, no promises he couldn't keep, just truth laid bare between them. "Then we fight." "With what army?" "Morrison's got money, connections, the law on his side when he needs it. We've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "We're right." Abe's laugh held no humor. "Being right doesn't stop bullets or legal papers or men with enough money to buy whatever justice they need. Maybe not. But it's what we have." They sat in silence, the weight of impossible odds pressing down on both their shoulders. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes that would make travel difficult and survival harder. "There's another option," Abe said quietly. Maggie waited. "I leave, take Molly and disappear. Without me here, they've got no reason to target Sable Peak. You do that, for her, for your people. In a heartbeat." The offer carried genuine sacrifice. Abe had found something approaching happiness here, the first peace he'd known since his wife's death. Walking away would mean returning to the endless flight that had defined their lives since Charleston. "What about what you want?" "What I want stopped mattering the day I learned where my family's money came from." His words echoed with the weight of a man who'd been carrying guilt too heavy for one person to bear. Maggie recognized the shape of that burden, the way it bent shoulders and stole sleep, and made every moment of joy feel stolen. "My brother died believing people like your family were beyond redemption," she said. "Maybe he was right. Maybe. Or maybe redemption isn't something you inherit. Maybe it's something you choose every day with every decision that matters." Abe studied her face, searching for condemnation that wasn't there. Instead, he found something harder to accept, the possibility of forgiveness, earned through action rather than granted through mercy. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Molly deserves to grow up somewhere she can put down roots. I'm saying my people deserve to keep what they've built. And I'm saying maybe it's time we stopped letting fear make our choices for us." Snow continued falling outside, blanketing the settlement in silence that felt less like peace than preparation. Storm weather was coming, the kind that tested everything built to withstand it. But for the first time since Abe had spoken his name in her kitchen, Maggie felt ready for the fight that was coming. The question was whether they could survive what the Ellsworth family was prepared to unleash on them both. The community meeting convened in the settlement's main hall on the coldest night of December. Every resident packed into the space, their breath visible in the lamplight, faces grave with the weight of decisions that would define their future. Maggie stood before them with the letter spread open on the rough wooden table. The paper seemed small to carry such enormous consequences, "Morrison's not working alone," she began. "The money backing him comes from Charleston, old plantation families who want to see us fail." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some voices carried fear, others anger. Mrs. Henderson clutched her grandson closer, the boy who'd recovered from fever thanks to Abe's medicine. "They're targeting us because of me," Abe said from the back of the room. His voice cut through the whispers, steady despite the weight of confession. "My family, my name, my presence here puts you all at risk." Thomas Chen stood first, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "What kind of risk?" "The kind that ends with Morrison owning everything from here to the next county," Joe answered. "The kind that makes Sable Peak just another piece of land sold to the highest bidder." "Then we sell," said Marcus Webb, a newer resident whose nervousness showed in every jerky movement. "Take Morrison's money and start over somewhere else." "With what?" Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with exhaustion. "This is the third place I've tried to build a life. I'm too old to run again." Her words echoed through the room. Everyone understood the arithmetic of displacement. The way each fresh start cost more than the last, until nothing remained but the certainty of never belonging anywhere. "There's another choice," said Rebecca Martinez, her young voice carrying surprising strength. "We fight." "Fight with what?" Webb's fear made him sharp. "Morrison's got lawyers, connections, more money than we'll see in a lifetime." "He's got all that," Rebecca agreed. "But we've got something else. We've got each other." The simple words landed heavy in the cold air. Around the room, faces shifted as residents looked at their neighbors with new understanding. They'd built more than just a settlement. They'd created family from strangers, hope from desperation. "Pretty words don't stop legal papers," Webb persisted. "Don't stop men with guns if it comes to that." "No," Abe said quietly, "but they might stop being necessary if we're smart about this." All eyes turned to him. He'd remained silent through most of the debate, letting others voice their fears and hopes. Now he stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Morrison's operation depends on secrecy," Abe continued. "On people not knowing who's really behind the land purchases, why certain properties get targeted." "You saying we expose him?" "I'm saying we expose them. All of them, make it public knowledge what's happening here and why." Dr. Franklin, the settlement's only formally educated resident, leaned forward with interest. "How exactly do we do that? The territorial newspapers won't print stories that make powerful families look bad. We go around the newspapers, use the networks that already exist." Abe looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze in turn. Every person here came from somewhere else, has connections to other places, other people who have faced similar situations. We tell them what's happening, let them tell others. "Word of mouth," Joe said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Information traveling through communities Morrison can't control." "Exactly. Make it too public to ignore, too widespread to contain." The plan began taking shape as residents added their own pieces to the strategy. Mrs. Chen had relatives in 3 different territories. Dr. Franklin corresponded with colleagues across the West. Even quiet Marcus Webb admitted to connections with other settlements that might prove valuable. But it was Molly who provided the most crucial insight. The child had been sitting silently beside her father, listening to adult conversations about futures and consequences. When she finally spoke, her small voice carried the clarity that sometimes came from seeing situations without the complications of adult fear. "Why don't we just tell everyone what the bad men did before?" she asked. "About the schools Papa helped and the people they hurt. Wouldn't that make people not want to help them anymore?" The room fell silent. Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that adults had missed entirely. "She's right," Dr. Franklin said slowly. "This isn't just about land speculation. It's about a powerful family trying to destroy a man for challenging their authority. That's a story people will remember." "More than that," Rebecca added, her eyes bright with possibility. "It's about whether folks like us get to build something lasting or just exist at the mercy of people who see us as temporary inconveniences." The energy in the room shifted. Fear remained, but it was balanced now by something stronger, the determination of people who'd finally found a place worth defending. "It won't be easy," Maggie warned. "Morrison will push back hard once he realizes what we're doing. The pressure will get worse before it gets better." "Let it get worse," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying the steel of someone who'd survived worse and kept going. "I've buried a husband and raised 5 children in places that didn't want me. I'm not abandoning the first home that does." One by one, the residents voiced their agreement. Not unanimous, but close enough. Webb and 2 others chose to accept Morrison's offer and leave before the situation escalated. No one blamed them. Everyone understood that courage came in different forms, and sometimes survival meant knowing when to retreat. But the majority remained. They would fight not with violence but with truth, not with weapons but with the power of stories shared across distances that money couldn't control. As the meeting disbanded, Abe found himself surrounded by people who'd chosen to risk their security for his right to exist among them. The weight of their trust felt heavier than any burden he'd carried before. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank us yet," Thomas Chen replied. "Wait until we see if any of us are still here come spring." But his words carried humor rather than despair. For the first time since Morrison had arrived, the residents of Sable Peak felt like they had a chance. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the settlement in pristine white that would be tracked with footprints come morning. The storm everyone feared was finally beginning, but they would face it together. That had to count for something in the arithmetic of survival that governed frontier life. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. But for tonight, it felt like the beginning of hope rather than the end of everything they'd built. The letters began arriving in January, carried by riders who pushed through mountain passes despite winter's bite. Responses to the story Sable Peak had sent across the territories, each one proof that truth could travel faster than money when it carried the weight of shared experience. A settlement in Colorado reported similar pressure from Charleston investors. A community in New Mexico had faced identical tactics 6 months earlier. The pattern emerged clear as footprints in fresh snow. The Ellsworth family and their allies had been systematically targeting any place that represented former slaves building something permanent. Dr. Franklin compiled the evidence with methodical precision, his lawyers' training serving them well. Each documented case strengthened their position, transformed their local struggle into something larger and more dangerous to ignore. Morrison felt the shift. His visits became more frequent, his offers more aggressive. The veneer of neighborly concern cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he told Maggie during his final visit. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached her cabin, his expensive coat making him appear alien against the settlement's humble landscape. "Making what harder?" "The inevitable. This land will be sold. Question is whether your people walk away with something or lose everything when the legal challenges start." His words carried new weight now. The Charleston families had moved beyond simple land speculation. They were prepared to use courts, territorial officials, any lever of power necessary to crush Sable Peak's resistance. "What legal challenges?" Morrison's smile held the satisfaction of a man revealing his strongest hand. "Questions about land grants issued to former slaves, whether certain territorial officials had authority to approve sales to people of questionable citizenship status." The threat landed like a physical blow. If successful, such challenges could void every deed, every claim, every legal foundation upon which communities like Sable Peak existed. The implications stretched far beyond one settlement. 48 hours, Morrison continued. After that, the lawyers get involved and things become much more complicated for everyone. He rode away, leaving tire tracks in the snow and the acrid smell of fear in the air. That evening, Abe found Maggie sitting by her fire, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The weight of impossible choices had settled on her shoulders, bending them toward earth. "He's not bluffing," she said without looking up. "No, he's not. Abe settled into the chair across from her, his presence steady as mountain stone. They'd grown comfortable with silence over the winter months, learned to read each other's thoughts in the space between words. I could still leave. Too late for that now. They've moved beyond targeting you specifically. This is about all of us. The truth hung between them, sharp as winter air. The Charleston families had revealed their true objective. Not just destroying Abe's attempt at redemption, but proving that former slaves couldn't build anything lasting enough to threaten the old order. Then we make our stand. With what? Morrison's got territorial judges in his pocket, enough legal firepower to drown us in paperwork before we can mount a defense. Abe leaned forward, firelight playing across features marked by sorrow but not defeated by it. With the one thing they can't buy or intimidate or make disappear through legal manipulation. Which is the truth, told loud enough and often enough that silence becomes impossible. The next morning brought riders from 6 different settlements, men and women who'd received Sable Peak's message and chosen to respond with more than letters. They arrived bearing supplies, moral support, and most importantly, witnesses who could testify to similar pressures in their own communities. Among them rode Judge Samuel Crawford, territorial circuit judge, whose reputation for fairness had survived 3 decades of frontier politics. His presence transformed their desperate stand into something approaching official legitimacy. "Heard you folks were having some trouble with land speculators," Crawford said, his weathered face giving away nothing of his intentions. "Trouble doesn't begin to describe it," Dr. Franklin replied, producing the carefully organized evidence they'd compiled. Crawford reviewed the documents with methodical attention, his expression growing graver with each page. When he finished, he looked up at the assembled residents with something approaching respect. "You've documented a conspiracy that reaches into territorial government," he said. "Corruption that threatens the legal foundation of a dozen communities. Can you stop it? I can make it very public. Sometimes that's enough." The hearing convened in Bitter Creek's largest building, packed with residents from settlements across 3 counties. Morrison sat with his lawyers, confident in their legal superiority. The Charleston families had sent representatives who radiated the casual arrogance of people accustomed to buying whatever justice they required. But they hadn't prepared for the power of coordinated testimony, for victim after victim stepping forward to describe identical patterns of intimidation and manipulation. They hadn't expected a territorial judge willing to risk his career for principles that seemed quaint in an era of purchased loyalties. Most of all, they hadn't anticipated Abe himself taking the stand. He spoke quietly, without drama or appeals for sympathy. He described his inheritance, his education about its true cost, his decision to give away wealth built on human suffering. He detailed his family's response, their systematic campaign to destroy anyone who challenged their version of proper order. His words fell into absolute silence. Even Morrison's lawyers seemed stunned by the calm precision of his testimony, the way he laid bare motivations that sounded monstrous when spoken aloud. When Judge Crawford delivered his ruling, his voice carried the weight of frontier justice at its finest. Morrison's operations were declared fraudulent. The Charleston family's representatives were ordered to cease all territorial land purchases pending federal investigation. Sable Peak's deeds were confirmed as legally valid, but the victory felt incomplete until the moment Crawford addressed Abe directly. "Son, you've paid a higher price for your principles than most men could bear. I hope you find the peace you've been seeking." 6 months later, Maggie stood in her kitchen teaching Molly to prepare her grandmother's cornbread recipe. The child's hands moved with growing confidence, guided by lessons learned from watching rather than formal instruction. Abe worked beside them, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. The domestic rhythm felt natural now, earned through seasons of shared struggle and mutual respect. When visitors arrived asking after the settlement's cook, Maggie answered with quiet pride, "This is Abe Ellsworth, our Abe." The name no longer carried poison. She transformed it through the simple act of choosing trust over fear, future over past. The man who wore it had earned the right to define its meaning through actions that honored rather than betrayed the values she held sacred. Outside their window, children played in the settlement's expanded gardens. New families had arrived throughout the spring, drawn by stories of a community that stood together against impossible odds. Sable Peak thrived not despite its struggles but because of them. Molly looked up from her cornbread dough, flour dusting her dark hair. "Miss Maggie, will you teach me your mama's song tomorrow? Which song is that, child? The one about being free?" Maggie smiled, her heart full with possibilities she'd never dared imagine during those desperate flight through Georgia swampland. Freedom came in many forms, but perhaps the sweetest was the liberty to build something lasting, something worthy of the struggles that had made it possible. "Yes, child, I'll teach you that song. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there." Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.